May I first take this opportunity on the Western Easter to wish everybody today a very happy Easter and obviously a very good day and a very great holiday. May everything be good and happy for yourselves and for your families. Well, even as we celebrate Easter, the world goes on, the war goes on in Ukraine. And yesterday I was reporting that Redovka, a Russian newspaper, was claiming that Bakhmut had been captured. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a flood of messages then appeared from all sorts of other sources denying that this was the case, saying that the fighting was still ongoing in Bakhmut. This morning, incidentally, Redovka is taking an interesting position. They continue to insist on the accuracy of their overall report that Ukraine was trying to pull its troops out of Bakhmut, that the road leading into Bakhmut from Chasiv Yar has been cut, even though they concede that there is still fighting going on in the town itself. So Redovka is not publishing a complete retraction. Maybe they're embarrassed because they made a mistake in what they were saying yesterday and that they're still clinging on, therefore, to some parts of their story, or maybe their original reports were roughly correct, but their overall assessment that the town had already been captured was, shall we say, premature. Having said that, over the last couple of hours, there's been a whole swathe of reports of all sorts of other locations in Bakhmut falling under Russian control. I saw one report which claimed that both the Metallurg and Avant-Garde stadiums are now under Russian control, that the Russians have gained control of the police station and various other buildings. I'm not going to spend time itemizing which buildings, but anyway, overall, the picture still seems to be one of significant Russian advances. And a Ukrainian channel conceded that Ukraine now only controls 10% of the town, so that the Russians, in effect, now control around 90% of the town. So that seems to be the situation in Bakhmut in itself. Russians continuing make very substantial gains. They're now within clear sight, it seems to me, of taking every single part of this town under control. There's some reports, again, from mainly Russian channels, that the Ukrainians have rushed reinforcements to the Bakhmut area to try to hold back the Russians or to prevent a total collapse of resistance there. But anyway, the direction of travel is clear. As I said, the Russians are continuing to make significant advances there. I'm going to make my own guess, which is that the Ukrainians by now have understood and accepted that they're going to lose Bakhmut. General Syrskyi, there's even a rumor that General Syrskyi has finally admitted as much to President Zelensky, that Bakhmut is indeed on the verge of being captured by the Russians, and that the Ukrainians privately understand this very well. I have to say, though, that is not inconsistent with the Ukrainians still mounting a fierce resistance within Bakhmut itself, a kind of rearguard operation, if you will, to allow the bulk of their forces to be withdrawn from the town. Anyway, we will see what happens. But definitely it seems to me that even if Redovka jumped ahead a little yesterday, it's now only a matter of time, a very short time, before Bakhmut is fully cleared of all its defenders by the Russians. Incidentally, there's also reports of continuing fighting, that the Russians continue to press the Ukrainians in the surrounding villages of Bogdanovka and Orekhovo, Vasilievka, but details about this are very sketchy. There's not very much news from elsewhere on the battle lines. As I said, for the moment, the clear Russian priority, it seems to me, is to wrap the Battle of Bakhmut up, to bring it finally to its conclusion. So, that's what I'm going to say about the battlefields. I no doubt one could say an awful lot more, but I'm not going to discuss it today. As I said, being away from London, I have only a limited amount of time available to me now. I'm going to turn to various reports that have appeared, specifically in the Washington Post. Now, the Washington Post has been reporting quite a lot recently about the war, and it's reporting, for example, that Ukraine is now so short of ammunition that they're having to husband the amount of ammunition they use, that they're having to create all kinds of substitute devices, that they're putting together kind of makeshift bombs to drop from drones because artillery fire is running down. The one thing that did strike me about this particular article in the Washington Post is that it said that Ukraine is firing around 7,000 rounds of ammunition, artillery ammunition a day. The Russians are firing, according to the Washington Post, more than 3 times as much. The 7,000 rounds a day is rather more than was the case a few weeks ago. Now, there have been reports from Russian sources that Ukraine has intensified its shelling over the last few weeks or so, perhaps in some sort of preparation for this offensive that it's preparing. But anyway, there's no real explanation of why there's been this jump from about 3,000 to 5,000 up to 7,000 rounds a day. It could be that the Washington Post is counting other things, other rounds as artillery shells. I mean, I understood the 3,000 to 5,000 to relate to heavy artillery shells. It could be that the Washington Post is treating lighter weapons as artillery, or it could be, as I said, that Ukraine is indeed using more artillery shells at the moment. But anyway, the overall story was of continued very heavy shortages of artillery and of ammunition, and of Ukraine being very short of shells, especially for its Soviet era guns, in other words, 152mm shells. And by the way, the same is true about shells for the Western guns, of which the Washington Post says that Ukraine doesn't have that many of anyway. Incidentally, and on that front, I should just say, spinning off a program that Alex Christoforou and I have done on the Duran, that the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Alexei Reznikov, has been traveling around Balkan and Mediterranean countries. He's visited Bulgaria, Greece, and Cyprus to try and get deliveries of artillery shells. Now, Bulgaria obviously does have a certain amount of 152mm artillery, or perhaps once did, because it was previously a part of the Warsaw Pact, and it did in fact manufacture 152mm shells at one time. And of course Greece has a sizable military for its size, which is reasonably well equipped with 155mm shells. Cyprus, of course, has a much smaller army altogether. I do find it really rather difficult to understand how the defense minister of Ukraine, on the eve of the Ukrainian offensive, is still running around small countries in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans asking for shells. But there we are. That seems to be the major story. Anyway, the other story in the Washington Post, and indeed in many places now, relates to these big document dumps. There's been a second one, by the way, which I have not had the opportunity to assess. Now, again, we're getting all kinds of reports about how the documents have been distorted, supposedly by the Russians, to inflate Ukrainian casualties, reduce Russian ones. The implication is that it's the Russians who've released these documents, which I think, by the way, is quite likely true. And the further implication is that this is all part of some great disinformation exercise on the eve of the Ukrainian offensive. Well, all I'm going to say about that is that I think these documents are genuine. About that, in fact, I have no doubt, and I don't think that they've been altered or manipulated in any particular way. What they do suggest to me is a complex picture. In some ways, the United States is fairly well informed about Russian military dispositions, which is completely unsurprising. They have very elaborate electronic intelligence systems, signals intelligence. They got many satellites. They got all of those things. So they know where the Russians have their positions, how many troops the Russians have, that sort of thing. They also claims that the United States has penetrated the Russian military and is able thereby to tip off Ukraine about where the Russians are about to launch attacks. The difficulty I have with this, and I'm not saying that the United States hasn't managed in some ways to get information from within the Russian military. That whether it has spies or not is another question. It's more likely, I would guess, that this is signals intelligence. But the difficulty I have with this is that most of the information that the United States is supposed to have tipped off Ukraine about is information that I'd already figured out myself from open sources. Thus, there was clear indications about the Russians launching particular missile attacks on certain locations. It was not difficult to work out that particular missile attacks were coming. Maybe the United States was able to pinpoint the precise locations that the Russians were going to attack. About that, I don't know. But if so, it seems that information was only given a few hours in advance. I'm going to guess this was achieved through signals intelligence. It also talks about the Russians not being able to achieve significant territorial gains over the winter, and at the same time of conducting a grinding war of attrition throughout the winter, one which would be difficult for Ukraine, present serious difficulties for Ukraine. The problem with that is that the Russians themselves, back in October, General Surovikin to be precise, came forward and said that they were not planning to conduct big arrow offensives, that they were going to fortify their lines, build up reserves, and grind the Ukrainians on the battle lines. So I can't help but think that what this looks like is a certain amount of genuine intelligence being combined with open source material and an element of spin as well. But there we go. I suppose this is not unusual in war. I've seen this sort of thing happen many times. Obviously, people like the President of the United States and his staff, they're not to be expected that they read TASS and summaries of interviews in the Russian media by General Surovikin. It's probably the case that they don't read telegram channels, both Russian and Ukrainian. So I can easily imagine that intelligence agencies scoop up all this information, open source and some of it private source, combine it all together, give a certain spin, and pass it on to the White House as in their intelligence summaries. And that makes total sense to me. But anyway, overall, the actual picture remains the same. And it's important to say that whatever the United States thinks it knows about the Russian military, it probably, or in theory, should know more about the Ukrainian military. But it's clear to me, at least, that a lot of this so-called intelligence ultimately derives from Ukrainian sources themselves. Anyway, the overall picture is that I don't think these documents add a huge amount of detail to what we actually know about the war itself. That is my own personal view. I certainly don't think they should be treated as providing an accurate picture of casualty numbers on either side. I don't think that they give a fully informed picture about the state of the war, and I don't think they give us any basis to predict the outcome of anything very much. They are interesting as providing more than anything else an image of the kind of information that is circulating within the Washington bureaucracy, and that does perhaps help to explain some US decisions. Now, a number of other short things before I come back to some of the more foreign policy and economic matters that I'm going to talk about. First of all, the story of the 6 men and a boat, the 6 guys in a boat. It wasn't 6 men, there was 1 woman, as I remember. The 6 guys in a boat story about the destruction of Nord Stream, the sabotage of Nord Stream, has now essentially been refuted by the Swedish prosecutors. They've said that as far as they're concerned, this was clearly a state-managed operation. They obviously do not believe in the 6 guys and a boat scenario. So that story, which appeared briefly, tantalizingly, shortly after Chancellor Scholz and President Biden met for that somewhat mysterious meeting in Washington when they had no advisors present with them. Well, that story has now essentially collapsed. I think we can, from this point on, accept that it was an exercise in disinformation. Somebody clearly in the United States was concerned by Seymour Hersh's account of events. They wanted to rush out an alternative story fast. They came up with the 6 guys in a boat story. They found a yacht and put some explosive residue there, tipped off the German investigators. The German investigators found the residue, the explosive residue there. The media were then primed, the New York Times and Die Zeit were then primed to carry this story, but the sheer implausibility of it made the entire story collapse. Now, the Swedish prosecutors haven't said which state they think might have carried out this attack. Supposedly, they all have an open mind. And I have to say that the mere fact that the 6 guys and a boat story has essentially collapsed and been discredited and has been dismissed by the actual investigators doesn't in and of itself, prove that Seymour Hersh's account is true. However, I have long taken the view that Seymour Hersh's account most probably is true, and the fact that this story was put together in such a hurry after Seymour Hersh published his account, and the fact that the first reports about the 6 guys in a boat story appeared in the New York Times, even though it didn't actually specifically mention 6 guys in a boat. All of that, to my mind, does rather point to the United States again, and does suggest very strongly that Seymour Hersh's story is true. I've already made it clear that, in my opinion, it almost certainly is true. Seymour Hersh is almost certainly got the correct account. That, at least, is my belief. If I've not yet seen any evidence, any clear evidence that would refute it, and I've noticed as well, by the way, and this bears repetition, that none of the senior people named by Seymour Hersh as the decision makers behind the attack on Nord Stream in the United States, Assistant Secretary Nuland, Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and CIA Director Burns, none of them has come forward and personally denied that they were in fact involved, and has said themselves that this account of what happened by Seymour Hersh is untrue. That's all been left to spokespeople, the usual spokespeople of the various departments. So that's, I think, one interesting story. There's been another curious story, which is from Slovakia, which is that the Slovaks are complaining that the MiG-29 fighter jets that they were intending to supply to Ukraine can't be supplied because they've been sabotaged by Russian technicians. I find that story completely fantastic. It is absolutely true that the Russians were providing technical support for these MiG-29s, but I can't believe that continued beyond the start of the fighting last February. I'm sure it's been an ongoing matter, stretching back. I'm sure that ended even sometime before. I think the simple fact is that these MiG-29s, which are old aircraft, have never been in particularly good condition, or at least haven't been in particularly good condition for a long time, because Ukraine is transitioning to, Slovakia, not Ukraine, is transitioning to Western fighter jets, and I think the Slovaks are coming up with this story that it was Russian technicians to explain why the promise they made to Ukraine of supplying these MiG-29s has not been fulfilled in the way that perhaps they told the Ukrainians that it would be. Now, on that topic, Ukraine has announced that it's buying more wheeled infantry fighting vehicles or armoured personnel carriers from Poland, around 200 of them. I'm not entirely sure whether these are new builds or taken from from Poland's existing arsenal of these wheeled vehicles. If it is the latter, then I really do wonder how many of these wheeled vehicles Poland is going to have left at the end of this, because it seems to me as if they are giving away pretty much everything they've got in that case to Ukraine. If these wheeled vehicles are coming from existing stocks, then all I would say about that is, again, that this is probably too late for an offensive which is likely to start within the next 2 or 3 weeks. Now, there's more one can say about Ukraine. And firstly, Ukraine yesterday launched a missile attack on the town of Feodosia in Crimea. And this was a long-range strike. It was about 250-kilometer strike. So it clearly wasn't done with an ATACMS missile. It almost certainly was done by some type of missile. Sorry, it wasn't done by a HIMARS missile. It doesn't seem to have been done by an ATACMS missile, because the United States, it seems, definitely hasn't supplied any such missiles. It could have been done by some missile or cruise missile that Ukraine has itself developed. There's been suggestions that it might have been another Strij drone adapted by Ukraine to serve as a cruise missile. Others are suggesting, perhaps more plausibly, that it was this new Grom air-to-surface missile, presumably launched by an aircraft, which Ukraine supposedly has completed development of. Whatever it was, this missile was shot down by Russia's air defense forces in Crimea. Again, this is an interesting incident. It perhaps suggests that Ukraine is testing Russia's air defenses over Crimea, trying to locate where the particular facilities are positioned, or it could be testing its own missiles, its own weapons in advance of the offensive, or perhaps it was hoping for some kind of lucky strike in a target on Crimea, in Crimea, that would garner it some favourable publicity at a time when the situation in Bakhmut is turning disastrous. Well, I'm not going to speculate, but it shows, this incident does show, that even without the ATACMS, Ukraine does have the capability to launch long-range missile strikes on Crimea using either Strij drones or Grom missiles, whatever. But it also shows that Russia's air defense systems over Crimea are working and are able to shoot down these missiles. Now, on a completely different front, Mr. Ignat, the Ukrainian commander of its air defense, has now admitted that the Russians are now increasingly using long-range, precision-guided glide bombs weighing both 500 kilos and 1,500 kilos, and that these are having very devastating effects on Ukrainian positions that they used against. And Ignat has also said that Ukraine has no ability to intercept these bombs. I think that on the Russian side it is different. I think that the Russians do possess a certain ability to intercept American glide bombs launched by Ukrainian aircraft. Anyway, Ignat has said that the only effective way of countering these glide bombs would be to attack the Russian aircraft that are launching them, and he's again said that for that he needs F-16s, which of course he hasn't got and isn't going to get before the start of this offensive, which is due to take place in 2 to 3 weeks. Whether those F-16 fighter jets would in fact enable Ukraine to shoot down these Russian aircraft that are launching these bombs, well, that is a completely different matter. But anyway, that is what Ignat has said. So the bombing is having an effect, and I've now seen pictures of Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, Russian Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, and they do indeed seem to be dropping bombs in the area of Vuhledar. So it's now clear that the Russians, after changing the commander in this part of the battlefront, have started to use their aviation as well to launch airstrikes on Ukrainian positions and air defenses in and around Vuhledar. So we'll see what effect that has, whether it does result in the Russians achieving more effective results in the Vuhledar area, as they've managed to do, using bombs in Avdiivka. But I suspect, again, that's going to take a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, the primary Russian focus, as I said, is Bakhmut. I'm going to speculate that once Bakhmut is cleared, the Russians will focus on Avdiivka and Seversk, and perhaps at some point thereafter they'll also decide to finally finish the fighting in Marinka and Vuhledar, a battle which, from a Russian point of view, has been rather difficult. Anyway, that's my summary of the situation in Ukraine. Now, there's more fallout from Macron's trip to China, and it's really quite fascinating to see the contrast between the way in which the Chinese media is covering this visit by Macron, which is trying to put the most positive spin on the visit as possible, implying that Macron came along and the trip was, from a Chinese point of view, a success. It consolidated China's relationship with the EU, that positive results were achieved, with a very bitter reaction that there's now increasingly been about this trip in the West. And there's now talk, really very bizarre talk, that Macron has actually betrayed the United States by going to China. And I have to say, this seems extraordinary to me, and that his meetings with China, his attempts to maintain a good relationship with China, to develop a dialogue with China, that these are all in some way a betrayal of the US, of the relationship between France and the United States, and between Europe and the United States. And this has been coupled by further attacks on Germany. Daniel Johnson, another commentator for the Daily Telegraph, has written an angry article complaining about how Germany continues to conduct a toxic love affair with Russia and China. Something which the Russians might find, by the way, most bizarre, and which I suspect many Germans would find bizarre as well, given the collapse in relations between Germany and Russia over the course of the last year. But anyway, we've had all of these bitter and angry articles, and I have to say, I think that this demonstrates the utterly false position in which Macron put himself in. On the one hand, he went to Beijing, continued a kind of dialogue with the Chinese leaders. There's even a picture of him walking in a garden, tieless, with a tieless Xi Jinping, both of them walking there. Sort of picture which is not going to go down well with some people in Britain especially, and in the United States even more. So that's one side. He's annoyed and upset the Europeans and the Americans, at least the Atlanticists, the neocons. They're furious with Macron. He failed in his stated purpose of getting China to shift policy on Russia. That was always an absurd idea. So they're rounding on him because of that. And he's ended up, it seems to me, actually, despite the positive spin you get in the Chinese media about his trip, he's ended up pleasing no one. The Chinese, we know this because of all the accounts about Xi Jinping sighing and looking frustrated during his meeting with Macron. The Chinese were not pleased by Macron's constant harping about Russia and Ukraine, and by his extraordinarily maladroit comments about China being colluding in a crime because of its close relationship with Russia, and about China needing to bring Russia to its senses and things of that kind. So the Chinese were not pleased with that. The neocons are furious with Macron because he didn't achieve his stated objective of shifting Chinese policy on Russia and Ukraine. And at the same time, given that failure, they're now alarmed that he is getting too close to Beijing. It just goes to show, to my mind, that in this kind of game, you cannot win if you try to play both sides. You have to take a position one way or the other. Either you are going to be wholly in the neocon camp, or you're going to do what previous earlier French presidents like de Gaulle, Pompidou, Giscard d'Estaing, Mitterrand to some extent, Chirac definitely all did, which is that you're going to try and pursue an independent foreign policy, independent, in this case, of the neocons in the United States. There is no midway between the two. The neocons, the hardliners in Washington and London and Brussels, expect total loyalty, or they will turn on you, especially if you go to Beijing telling them that you're going to pass on all of these warnings to the Chinese and try to change the Chinese mind about an issue, a topic like Ukraine, and then fail. So this is something that Macron himself has never, it seems to me, understood. If all these arms supplies, all these strong words about Russia that he's making are intended to buy him space as he continues with his dialogue with China and Russia, which is what he sometimes suggests, then it's not achieving that. It's merely making everybody on every side distrust him. But there it is. It's classic Macron. He's always, I think, had an exaggerated view of his own intelligence and his own ability to handle things. And anyway, we see the result. On the topic of visits to Beijing, I understand that Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, is on her way there as well soon. And apparently more officials from the European Commission are going to Beijing too. This procession of European leaders to Beijing, trying to get China to change its mind, is going to continue unabated, despite the fact that the Chinese, as we've seen with Macron, are simply not interested. Now, I'm going to just quickly finish this program with a brief comment about the state of the Russian economy. It's clear that inflation now is well below 4%. It's also perhaps falling too fast for the Russians. They're probably worried that with interest rates reasonably high, that might persuade some people to keep their rubles in bank accounts rather than actively use them. Anyway, who knows? So at the moment, as I said, inflation is falling, unemployment is falling, demand is rising, and industrial production is also rising. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there was an awful lot of talk about the state of the budget. The Russians have now given quarterly figures for the size of the budget deficit in January, February, March. They say that the aggregate budget deficit over that period was $29 billion, of which, of course, 25 billion would have been accounted for by the deficit in February. That was the big deficit. It then increased to 35 billion in February. There was another $10 billion deficit in February. And then March is very enigmatic because there was some information over the course of March provided by Prime Minister Mishustin. This was, I think, on the 28th of March, in which he seemed to suggest a budget deficit of around $40 billion in March. Then the following day, early in April, the Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov said that on the last day of March, the Russian Finance Ministry had received a big payment of $32 billion, which obviously reduced the deficit further. But it looks as if the $29 billion figure for the deficit in March is correct, it looks as if, in fact, there must have been more receipts than Siluanov has spoken about, because that would suggest a surplus in March. I'm not going to pretend that I understood this all fully. I would just say again that this is not, to my mind, a particularly important issue, but Siluanov, for what it's worth, has said that one of the reasons for the deficit in January, February, was accelerated spending in those months. He says that this is going to fall. He's confirmed that tax receipts from the oil and gas sector have been around 45% down from last year. As I've said already, that was almost certainly agreed with the industry before the beginning of the year, whilst the budget plan was being worked out. But he also said that he expects oil and gas receipts to grow over the course of the year. And he says that the finance ministry is still marking in a total budget deficit of 2% of GDP. Well, as I said, I don't pretend that I have a clear understanding of what happened in March, but it's clear, whatever it was, that the Russians have their situation, their budget under control. Now, the other thing that, again, lots of people are talking about is that there's been a significant softening of the ruble over the last 2 weeks. It's now trading, last time I saw it was around $81 to 81 rubles to the dollar. There's actually a very simple explanation for this, and it's been pouring in since December, and this is the recovery of demand in Russia. And the recovery of demands is leading to a surge in imports at the same time that that revenue from oil exports has fallen. And the Russians always respond to these kind of situations by letting the ruble fall in value. This is actually Russian policy. It's a well-established policy. Some people refer to it as a dirty float. Well, there you go. I don't know why it's particularly dirty. But the idea is, if your deficit, if your trade balance, your surplus starts to decline, you let your currency, your currency, its exchange rate to the dollar, fall, and not just the dollar now, but also the RMB fall. That makes your exports that increases the amount of money in terms of foreign currency. Well, it increases rather the value, the ruble value of your exports, and it makes your imports more expensive, thereby to some extent choking off imports. People should not spend any more than I think they should spend too much time stressing about deficits. They shouldn't spend too much time stressing about these sort of ruble movements. This is not like what happened in March last year, when following the sanctions, there were people were going to the banks and were trying to convert their rubles into dollars because they were afraid that the sanctions might result in some kind of financial collapse. That cannot happen because the Russian government in March last year took steps, imposed capital controls to prevent that, and they're able to prevent it at the moment. And obviously the overall state of the economy with falling inflation would not encourage people, and by the way, fairly high interest rates would not encourage people to rush to their banks and change rubles into dollars or RMB or whatever anyway. So as I said, you look at the major macroeconomic indicators, they point to a continued recovery. As I said, don't fully understand what happened to the budget in March. It could be that they did achieve some kind of a surplus, which is not impossible. But as I said, I'm going to wait until I have more complete figures before I know for certain. But overall, the budget situation is under control. And the situation with the ruble is no different from what it has often been. So that's me for today. More from me soon. No doubt we'll be discussing further what's happening in Bakhmut and other places. But that is me for the day, and have a very good day. And to repeat again, a very happy Easter to you all. And remember, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Go to our shop and check out the great things that you will find there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, rucksacks, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel.